Daniel Keats had imagined the visiting hall to feel colder, but the air carried a dry stillness instead. The long table between them was bolted to the floor, the kind of precaution that spoke volumes about the man seated opposite. The killer smiled as if welcoming an old friend. Daniel kept his voice steady, guiding the conversation toward the earliest known crime scene. The man leaned forward slightly, his words slow and deliberate, painting a picture of a staged scene in such vivid detail that Daniel could almost smell the chemicals used to scrub the floor. Halfway through the description, the killer mentioned a small item that was never released to the public. Daniel's pulse quickened. He replayed the words in his mind, certain he had heard them right. The detail matched an unsolved case from 2 years earlier, one believed to have no connection. The killer paused, letting the silence settle like dust. Then he said something that made Daniel forget to breathe. Daniel forced himself to sit completely still, though every instinct urged him to lean in and demand clarification. The killer's voice had been steady, but the weight of the last phrase hung in the air like smoke. The mention of that one small item, a pale blue button with a cracked edge, was something Daniel had only ever seen buried in a supplementary case file from 2 years earlier. That file had been tied to a victim, who was never officially linked to the man sitting across from him. Now the detail was out in the open, spoken as casually as if it were common knowledge. Daniel steadied his breathing, mentally cataloging every nuance of the moment. The visiting hall's fluorescent lighting hummed faintly above them, casting hard edges on the killer's angular face. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, but there was an undercurrent of something metallic in the air, like cold coins. Behind Daniel, a guard stood with arms crossed, eyes scanning for the smallest sign of trouble. The guard's presence was reassuring, but Daniel knew the true danger in this room was not physical. It was the control the killer could exert over the conversation. He shifted in his chair, careful not to break eye contact. The killer's posture was relaxed, one arm resting loosely on the table, the other hand tapping an irregular rhythm against the steel surface. Daniel recognized the tapping as deliberate, a way to force him into noticing, perhaps even to unsettle him. He let it pass without reaction. Instead, Daniel returned to the timeline of the murders. The staged scenes had always been the killer's signature. Each crime scene looked almost cinematic, chairs deliberately overturned, photographs placed at strange angles, objects positioned with too much precision to be accidental. The forensic teams had documented everything, but even the most seasoned detectives had admitted there was a sense of something extra in each scene, a hidden layer of meaning that was never fully decoded. Daniel leaned into that angle now, asking about the placement of objects in the earliest case. He phrased his questions as observations, giving the killer room to elaborate without feeling interrogated. The man smiled slightly, as though Daniel had stepped onto the correct path in some twisted game. His description became more vivid, almost like a director explaining the set of a film. Daniel noted every word mentally, especially the moments when the killer's tone shifted. A brief tightening of the jaw, a longer pause before certain phrases, small cues that hinted at something beneath the surface. Daniel's training told him that these moments often masked either a lie or an emotional truth too raw to reveal outright. As the killer continued, he referenced another object, a folded paper napkin placed inside a kitchen drawer. That detail had never been reported publicly. Daniel's pulse quickened again. He knew from the internal reports that the napkin had traces of ink that bled into the paper, as if it had once held a note. No note was ever recovered. Daniel kept his tone even, acknowledging the detail without surprise. He wanted to give the impression that he already knew everything. It was a technique meant to encourage the subject to keep talking without feeling they were revealing too much. The killer appeared to respond to this, leaning back in his chair as if settling into a comfortable rhythm. Minutes passed in this careful exchange. Outside the thick glass of the visiting hall, Daniel caught glimpses of other inmates being led back to their cells. The sound of boots on tile echoed faintly, a reminder of the world beyond this conversation. But here, in this enclosed space, It felt as though time had slowed to match the deliberate pace of the killer's speech. When the killer described the most recent confirmed murder, Daniel paid particular attention to his hands. The tapping had stopped, replaced by slow, deliberate gestures. Each movement seemed tied to a specific word or phrase, almost like punctuation. Daniel wondered if these movements were rehearsed, part of a psychological tactic to draw focus. The climax of the killer's account came when he described the victim's positioning. His tone carried a strange pride, as if the arrangement of the body had been a statement only he could fully appreciate. Daniel recognized the pattern instantly. It was similar to the arrangement in an unsolved case file involving the blue button. That case had always been considered an outlier. Now the connection was too strong to ignore. Daniel's mind raced. If this link was real, it meant at least one more victim could be attributed to this man. It also meant that somewhere, buried in those old files, might be the key to understanding the staging. But he could not show too much interest now. He shifted the conversation, steering it toward the killer's time before arrest. The man became more animated, speaking about travel, jobs, and brief encounters with strangers. Daniel recognized some of these accounts as deliberate fabrications meant to cloud the timeline. Still, within the falsehoods, there were slivers of truth, names that matched witness statements, descriptions that aligned with crime scene photos. As the session neared its allotted end, Daniel checked the clock discreetly. 15 minutes remained. The killer's eyes followed his glance, and a knowing smirk spread across his face. "You are wondering if you have enough yet," the man said without saying it in so many words, the implication hanging in his expression. Daniel met his gaze evenly, refusing to let the silent challenge take root. Instead, he asked about a location mentioned earlier, a storage facility on the outskirts of a small industrial area. The killer's demeanor shifted. He leaned forward again, voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a secret meant for Daniel alone. His words painted a scene of dust-covered boxes, the smell of old wood and the creak of metal doors. He spoke of something hidden there, something he had left untouched for years. Daniel kept his breathing steady, though inside, every instinct screamed that this was important. He committed the description to memory, noting the sensory details, the specific sequence of actions. The killer's tone was too measured for this to be a casual fabrication. The guard's voice cut through the tension, announcing that time was nearly up. Daniel gathered his notes slowly, giving the impression that nothing urgent had been revealed. But in truth, the storage facility detail had shifted the entire weight of the investigation in his mind. As he stood, the killer tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and challenge. It was the look of a man who believed he had just handed over a puzzle that would consume Daniel entirely. Daniel walked out of the visiting hall with the echo of that look burned into his thoughts. The corridor beyond felt cooler, the air moving in faint drafts through narrow vents. The guard escorted him back toward the processing area, where his belongings waited in a plastic bin. Outside, the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the prison yard. Daniel paused for a moment, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The interview had given him far more than he expected, and yet it had also left him with a sense that he had barely scratched the surface. In his mind, the image of a dust-covered storage unit door loomed large. Somewhere inside could be the missing link between the staged scenes, the blue button, and the napkin. But Daniel also knew that walking into that space could mean stepping directly into the killer's carefully laid plan. Still, the decision was already made. Daniel left the grounds with a measured pace and a careful mind. The late afternoon light had cooled into the first edge of evening. The road beyond the outer fence carried a low hum of ordinary traffic. The ordinary felt almost unreal after the focus of the visiting hall. He sat in his car and let the engine idle. He did not want the killer to occupy every thought, and yet that was the only path forward. He began to shape a plan that would hold up under scrutiny. He needed a warrant. He needed a controlled search. He needed a record trail that would stand in court and survive a defense built on misdirection. He drove to the task force office in steady flow. The building was quiet at this hour. Lights glowed in a few rooms and left others in shadow. He carried the interview notes and his thin case binder. He found an empty conference room and set the materials on the table. He stood for a moment and centered himself. He laid out the timeline. He wrote the earliest homicide date on a whiteboard in careful block letters. He marked the gaps between the scenes. He drew a column for staging patterns. He added the blue button and the folded napkin. He added the storage unit hint and the curious tone the killer used when he described dust and the smell of old wood. He opened his laptop and began an affidavit draft. He kept the language plain and exact. He cited the interview. He included that the killer referenced a storage site and that the description aligned with staging markers in multiple scenes. He cross-referenced internal reports and logged which details had never been public. He included the blue button and the napkin as corroborating markers. He described the risk of delay. He cited the possibility of an accomplice who might access the unit if word leaked. He requested authority to search any unit registered to pseudonyms or shell entities linked to the killer. He requested authority to seize items related to victim identification and staging. He requested authority to image any digital media found on site. He paused to check the chain of logic. It held. The facts supported the probable cause. He forwarded the draft to the lead detective and the prosecutor on call with a concise note. He then stood and walked the hall to the records alcove. He pulled utilities data and business licenses for storage sites in the industrial band, where the killer had once held a short-term job. He built a list of facilities. He flagged those with month-to-month clients and cash payment options. He pulled vendor invoices from a paint supplier used near two of the scenes. He found a recurring purchase that matched the brand used to scrub one floor. The buyer name was a generic services company with no online footprint. The address linked to a post office box in the same industrial strip. He returned to the conference room and mapped the path from the paint supplier to the nearest storage yard. The distance was short. He noted the time window consistent with the killer's old shift pattern. The yard had a back gate near a rail spur. The spur had a fence-line gap reported in a city maintenance request the prior year. The gap had been marked as repaired. He noted the repair date. It was within a week of a victim disappearance. The pattern felt too clean to ignore. His laptop pinged with the prosecutor's reply. The message was brief. The affidavit was solid. A judge would review within the hour. Daniel used that time to build a search plan. He listed equipment. He asked for a photographer and a scene tech. He asked for a records officer to log every item at first sight. He added an evidence number sequence to avoid duplication with open cases. He laid out a safe approach. He planned for body-worn camera use by the entry team. He requested the facility manager's presence for a lock and unit log check. He specified that any live hazard would mandate an immediate pullback. He flagged the possibility of booby traps. The killer liked theater. Theater invited spectacle. He did not want any part of that. The approval came through as daylight fell away. The judge had signed. The warrant had a tight scope and clear authority. Daniel stepped into the ready room and issued the basics to the small team. He kept his voice steady and neutral. He spoke of scenes and timelines and routine. He did not speak of dread. He did not speak of the look the killer had given him. He let procedure be the main narrative. They rolled out in two vehicles. The air had a clean chill that cut through the last of the daytime warmth. The industrial strip sat quiet. A few windows glowed with desk lamps. Most doors were locked and dark. They pulled into the storage yard under a low security light. The chain-link fence lined the perimeter. The manager met them near the office. He wore a jacket and a cautious expression. Daniel presented the warrant and a copy of the affidavit. The manager nodded and retrieved a ledger and a tablet. They walked row by row along corrugated metal doors. The manager cross-checked unit numbers and client names. The ledger held a generic services company tied to a medium-sized unit near the back. The tenant had paid in cash. The move-in date fell within the window of two unsolved cases. The payment history was steady and uneventful. No late fees. No change of address. No unusual access flags. The manager keyed the log of gate entries. The unit had been accessed twice in the past year. Both entries fell near the anniversaries of two confirmed murders. The hair on Daniel's arms rose. He kept his face calm. They reached the unit. The door was closed and secured with a common lock. The metal smelled of old rain and oil. The concrete lane carried tire stains and a faint trail of dust. Daniel scanned the frame and the lock with a small flashlight. No immediate signs of tampering. No suspicious wires. He stepped back and had the photographer document the door from wide to tight frames. He had the tech swab the lock and handle for touch DNA. He knew the odds of clean recovery were low. Still, the record would matter later. He nodded to the manager who provided a bolt cutter. The tech cut the lock in one clean movement. The sound rang out sharp in the quiet yard. The door rolled up on a slow track. The first breaths of air from inside carried that same blend he recalled from the interview. Dust, old wood, a dry mineral bite. The beam from the flashlight revealed a neat interior, cardboard boxes in a grid, a narrow aisle down the middle, a wooden wardrobe against the back wall, a folding table to the left, a cork board to the right. Not a mess, not random. Daniel held the team at the threshold and took in the first impression. The staging was clear even here. The boxes bore handwritten labels in block letters. The labels were simple and bland: household, tools, misc. The cork board held blank index cards pinned in straight rows. The wardrobe had a key in the lock. The folding table had a clean cloth draped over it. At the center sat a single object under a clear plastic dome. The dome had a faint fog on the inside surface, as if it had been wiped hours before and closed tight. The photographer captured the scene from multiple angles. Each shot had a ruler edge and a marker tag. Daniel stepped in with measured steps. He scanned for trip hazards and wires. He saw none. He moved to the table and leaned close without touching. The dome covered a small display. A child's marble sat in a shallow dish of white sand. The marble was pale blue with a cracked swirl inside the glass. The color made his pulse quicken. He logged the detail verbally for the camera. A blue marble. Cracked interior swirl, white sand, clear dome. Cloth cover beneath. He backed away and directed the tech to swab the dome rim. He turned to the wardrobe. The key sat upright. He logged the key position. He stood to the side of the door swing and opened it slowly. The hinges creaked in a thin tone. Inside the wardrobe hung a row of shirts on wire hangers. Each shirt had a dry cleaner tag pinned neatly to the collar. The dates on the tags were written out rather than stamped. The handwriting matched the box labels. Beneath the shirts sat a shoebox. He photographed the arrangement and then lifted the shoebox lid. Inside lay a stack of folded paper napkins tied with string. Each napkin bore faint ink bleed. The top napkin carried a ghost of words, not enough to read, enough to know that words had once been there. He felt the shift in the room. It was not temperature, it was the weight of intent. The unit was not a storage space. It was a stage. Every object fed the same theme: control, order, coded meaning. He moved to the cork board. He studied the pattern of blank cards. The pins formed a grid that matched the grid of boxes. Each row of cards aligned with a row of boxes. Each column aligned with the aisle depth. He traced a path with his eyes and noticed one pin that differed from the rest. It held a card at a minuscule tilt. He photographed it and marked its position. He went back to the boxes and began with the front left. He opened the lid and found clean tools nested in foam. The tools smelled of solvent. The foam was new, no dust on the cut edges. He noted the care. He closed the box and moved along the row. More tools, then household goods, then empty boxes that held only air and a faint soap scent. The empties felt deliberate. They built the sense of order and yet held nothing. Midway down the aisle he found a box marked miscellaneous. Inside lay a shallow tray with small items: buttons, coins, thread spools, a broken watch band. The blue button stood out at once, not one but three, each with a crack at a slightly different angle. He logged the count and the detail. He found a small envelope beneath the tray. Inside the envelope sat a plastic key card from a budget motel chain. No location name. A strip of tape on the back carried a date written out in words. The date matched a disappearance that had never been linked. He breathed once and let the air out slow. He had the team collect the marble display last. Its position felt symbolic. It should remain until the rest of the scene had been documented. He moved back to the wardrobe and examined the lower shelf. A ledger lay flat against the wood. He opened it and found neat entries in the same block hand. Each page held a two-column table. Left column had a day and a season written out. Right column had a single word. The words were not names, they were objects: chair, photograph, mirror, candle. Then one that made his scalp tight: script. He traced the dates. Several aligned to the staging elements in confirmed cases. A few aligned to the anniversaries of unsolved cases. One aligned to the payment logs of this very unit. He directed the records officer to begin page-by-page scans. He moved to the back corner and knelt to look at the floor. The concrete had a grid of faint scuffs that did not match the current box layout. The scuffs suggested a previous arrangement: a square in the center, a rectangle off to the right, a narrow void near the wardrobe. He noted it all. The air shifted as a breeze pushed under the door and moved the cloth on the table. The dome fog cleared slightly. Beneath the marble and the sand lay a photograph trimmed to a circle that matched the dish. It had been hidden by the sand. The edge now peeked through by a hair. He signaled the photographer and then the tech. They lifted the dome with care. They removed the marble and brushed the sand with a soft brush. The image came into view. It was a photograph of a floor. The floor held a faint imprint of a shoe sole. The sole had a chipped edge near the heel. The imprint had a blue cast from a filter or exposure. The blue echo felt intentional. Daniel felt the room tighten again. The killer had left him a map made of metaphors. He wondered how deep the map went. The cork board cards, the ledger words, the boxes, the wardrobe, the napkins, the marble, the sand, the photograph. Each was a token. Each was a vector. The tech called from the doorway in a low tone. The entry log at the gate showed a second card ping in the last hour. The camera had caught a vehicle at a distance. The plate was not legible. The timestamp aligned with their arrival by a few minutes. There was a chance that someone had been nearby and had turned away when the team rolled in. Daniel stepped to the threshold and scanned the dark lanes. The yard was silent. The rail spur beyond the fence was a darker strip against the night. A faint odor of diesel hung in the air. He looked back into the unit and then to the far fence line. The focus split in his mind. He had a meticulous scene in front of him and the ghost of movement outside. He had to choose which to chase first. He stood still and gathered his breath. He counted 4 beats. He turned to direct the team into a split pattern. The distant sound of metal on metal scraped across the night from beyond the rail spur, then stopped. Daniel moved toward the sound without haste, but with a purpose clear enough that the guard at the gate straightened and adjusted his stance. The scrape of metal had been short, almost reluctant, as if whoever made it was weighing whether to continue. The rail spur beyond the fence sat in partial shadow, broken only by the spill of light from a pole at the corner of the yard. Daniel signaled for the photographer to remain inside the storage unit and keep the scene locked down while a second tech guarded the entry. He motioned for 2 officers to follow him toward the fence. The chain link rattled faintly when the breeze pushed against it. Daniel crouched near the section where the city maintenance report had once noted a gap. The repair was visible, new metal laced into old, the join marked by clean welds. But at the base, near the ground, a small portion of the mesh bulged outward, not broken but subtly loosened. A person could press it open further if they knew where to place their hands. Daniel shone his light through the gap. The rail spur on the other side was empty except for a stack of pallets and an old service cart with a missing wheel. He scanned the ground and found a faint indentation in the gravel, fresher than the rest, angled toward the dark stretch beyond the light's reach. He did not step through. Procedure demanded control of the current scene first, but he logged the direction and the relative position to the storage unit. Returning to the team, Daniel ordered the fence section photographed in detail. He had the impressions marked with chalk for scale. The possibility of a second party in the area tightened the scope of the operation. Every item inside the unit had to be processed faster than planned, without sacrificing accuracy. If the killer had an accomplice, tonight's find might already be compromised. Back inside the unit, Daniel reviewed the items already cataloged. The marble, the sand, and the photograph were now secured in an evidence case. The wardrobe's contents had been boxed and tagged. The ledger was half-scanned, with each page slip-sheeted to prevent smudging. Daniel turned his attention to the cork board. The tilted card still drew his eye. He removed it carefully and found faint pencil marks on the reverse. They formed a series of short vertical lines, grouped in 3s and 4s. He recognized the pattern as a basic tally mark count. The total came to 14. 14 matched the official body count attributed to the killer. But there were other cases, cold files, with similar staging elements that had never been included in that tally. The implication was sharp. 14 might not represent the total number of victims. It might represent something else entirely. Daniel ordered each card removed, front and back photographed and markings logged. Several had no writing, but 4 others bore partial symbols: a circle, a triangle, an arrow, and a pair of parallel lines. None of these matched anything in the case files directly, but they could be stylized versions of objects noted at certain scenes. The next discovery came from a box labeled household, 3rd row from the back. Inside was a battered tin lunchbox lined with black felt. Nestled inside were small vials, each sealed with a rubber stopper. The labels on the vials were handwritten, each bearing a single word: oak, salt, ash, lime. Daniel noted that these were substances found in trace amounts at multiple scenes, though never in such pure form. He wondered whether the vials were trophies or tools or both. The scene text suggested swabbing the inside of the lunchbox lid. Daniel agreed, adding that the felt lining should be vacuumed for trace hairs or fibers. The methodical work steadied his thoughts, but the edge of urgency remained. Outside, the night air carried a low hum, not from the facility but from somewhere farther along the rail line. With the major items logged, Daniel initiated a final sweep of the unit. He traced the scuff marks on the floor again, comparing them to the current box layout. The previous arrangement suggested an open space in the center, large enough for a table or other focal object. He noted that the marble display had been near the center now, but not aligned exactly with those older scuffs. The change could mean the killer had restaged the unit after his last access. The photographer called him over to the wardrobe's top shelf. Taped flat against the underside of the shelf was a small strip of paper. On it were 4 sets of numbers written in block digits. Each set resembled coordinates. Daniel copied them into his notebook, resisting the urge to look them up on his phone. That would come later under secure conditions. For now, they were tagged and bagged like any other item. Once the last photograph was taken, Daniel signaled the team to begin the controlled packing of evidence for transport. Every box was sealed with tamper tape, labeled, and carried out under camera view. The manager signed each chain of custody form with a steady but pale hand. Daniel assured him that the unit would be resealed by the department once emptied. As the vehicles were loaded, Daniel stood for a moment at the open doorway of the now empty unit. The space felt hollow without the objects, yet the atmosphere of deliberate arrangement lingered. He thought of the killer's expression in the interview room, that calculated glint, the confidence of someone who believed they had scripted the next move long before Daniel arrived. The convoy rolled out of the yard and into the industrial strip. Daniel's vehicle took the lead, heading toward the evidence facility. In the rearview mirror, the storage yard lights receded, and the rail spur disappeared into darkness. Halfway to the facility, the radio crackled. A patrol unit had been dispatched to check a disturbance reported near the rail spur. The caller had described hearing a sharp metallic clang followed by hurried footsteps. The location matched the direction Daniel had noted earlier from the fence gap. The dispatcher added that the patrol's first sweep had found nothing, but they were widening the search. Daniel keyed his mic, instructing them to secure any footprints or objects, no matter how minor. He kept his voice level, but the implications churned in his mind. If someone had been watching, they might already know what was found in the unit. When they reached the facility, the evidence text moved with practiced precision. Items were logged, weighed, and photographed again under controlled lighting. Daniel stayed close to the marble display, watching as the sand was sifted for trace material. Tiny fragments of something metallic appeared, shavings, perhaps from a tool. Each piece was collected and sealed. The photograph beneath the marble was scanned at high resolution. Digital enhancement brought out the shoe sole pattern in greater detail. The chipped heel edge now showed a faint secondary mark, almost like a manufacturer's logo partially worn away. That detail could be matched against old surveillance footage if a suspect's shoe was ever visible. By the time the last item was secured, it was past midnight. Daniel left the facility with a copy of the coordinate numbers, the ledger scans, and high-res images of the photograph. The streets were quiet. He drove to his apartment but did not go inside right away. Instead, he sat in the driver's seat, engine off, replaying the killer's voice in his head. The cadence, the deliberate word choice, the way he had offered that storage unit detail like a gift. The gift had been real, and it came with a shadow. Somewhere out there, perhaps near that rail spur, someone else was moving under the killer's influence. Daniel locked his car, climbed the steps, and knew sleep would not come. The next step was to follow the coordinates. But first, he had to decide whether to do it in daylight with a full team, or in darkness when shadows could hide both him and whoever might already be there. Daniel arrived at the task force briefing room before sunrise. The air inside carried the faint smell of brewed coffee and dry paper. A projector hummed at the far end, casting a pale rectangle onto the wall. He set his case binder and laptop on the central table and began pinning photographs to the corkboard along one side of the room. The blue marble under the dome, the cracked swirl inside the glass, the ledger pages, the corkboard cards, the vials, and the shoebox of folded napkins all found their place in neat rows. By the time the others filed in, the board had taken on the appearance of a puzzle half solved. Lead Detective Sanders entered last, carrying a paper cup and a folder thick with overnight reports. He set it down without comment and took a seat. Daniel stood beside the board, hands clasped loosely, and began with a simple timeline. He described the interview sequence, the deliberate mention of the storage unit, and the sensory details that matched the killer's staging habits. He moved next to the search itself. Each image projected onto the wall in sequence. The wardrobe, the lunchbox with labeled vials, the tilted index card with tally marks, the ledger with single-word entries, and finally, the marble and sand display with the concealed photograph. Daniel's voice remained even, but the weight of the evidence was clear in the room's stillness. He described the photograph in detail: the floor surface, the faint shoe imprint, the chipped heel edge, and the possible partial logo. The lab was already enhancing it for potential brand and model identification. He outlined the coordinate numbers found taped beneath the wardrobe shelf, noting that their format matched standard GPS coordinates when divided correctly. Sanders leaned forward at that point, his expression sharpening. "You have them already translated?" The question did not require an answer out loud. Daniel simply nodded and brought up a map overlay. 4 points appeared on the projected screen, each in a rural or industrial fringe, none within direct view of a populated area. Daniel explained the significance. The first 2 points were in proximity to old cases, one confirmed, one still classified as undetermined. The third was near a riverbank that had been searched years ago but yielded nothing. The fourth had no direct link to any known scene. It was this last one that concerned him most. He pointed to the timeline again, overlaying the coordinate points with the dates from the ledger entries. The alignment was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Ledger word, chair, linked to a scene with a victim posed in one. Ledger word, mirror, tied to a case where a small mirror had been placed under the victim's hand. Ledger word, script, the storage unit find. The fourth coordinate matched a ledger entry with the word ember, which did not yet match any known evidence. The briefing shifted into planning mode. Sanders proposed simultaneous site visits for all 4 coordinates. Daniel argued for a staggered approach, pointing out the possibility of surveillance by an accomplice. If all sites were hit at once, the element of surprise could be lost. The room debated in measured tones, weighing resources, risk, and the potential for cross-contamination of evidence if an unobserved party arrived after the team. It was agreed that the first coordinate tied to the confirmed case would be the immediate priority. Daniel would lead, with Sanders running command from a secondary location. The others would prepare surveillance packages for the remaining sites, ready to move if new intelligence came in. The meeting broke, and Daniel gathered his materials. Before leaving, he returned to the corkboard display and stared at the blue marble photograph again. The chipped heel impression seemed almost to be leaning toward one side, as if in mid-turn. It was a small detail, but it gave the static image a sense of movement. The convoy to the first coordinate left just after 8. The destination was an overgrown lot behind a disused warehouse. The building had been shuttered for years, its windows boarded and its lot choked with weeds. The coordinates led not to the structure itself, but to a patch of ground near a collapsed section of chain link. Daniel stepped out, the cold morning air biting through his jacket. The ground underfoot was uneven, a mix of dirt, gravel, and stray shards of broken brick. He moved slowly, eyes scanning for any disruption in the surface. The site techs followed, setting down equipment cases and beginning a perimeter mark with survey flags. Near the coordinate point, Daniel saw a small depression in the soil, partially covered by a sheet of corrugated metal. The rusted panel bore a faint smear of something pale along one edge. He lifted it carefully, revealing a shallow pit lined with old tarp material. Inside lay a single object, a wooden chair, legs cut to uneven lengths, seat stained dark in irregular patterns. He circled the pit slowly, taking in the placement. The chair's position matched the pose from the chair ledger case down to the tilt of its backrest. No footprints were visible in the loose soil. The recent rain had softened and then dried it into a hardened crust. Daniel ordered the chair photographed in place before any attempt to remove it. Once the images were complete, a tech swabbed the stain for preliminary testing. Another took soil samples from beneath each leg. The wood creaked faintly when touched, as if retaining a memory of weight. Daniel could not help but recall the killer's voice in the interview room, describing the satisfaction of arranging a scene. As the chair was lifted from the pit, something clinked against one of its back legs. Daniel crouched and found a small metal tag wired in place. The tag bore a number etched into its surface, not a serial, but a date written in words, identical in style to the wardrobe shelf coordinates tape. The date was not one linked to any known case. He straightened and looked toward the perimeter. The air was still, but the sensation of being observed returned like a pressure on the back of his neck. Beyond the collapsed fence, the empty windows of the warehouse reflected the pale sky, offering no hint of movement. The first coordinate had yielded something tangible. What the next 3 held would either unravel the killer's narrative or tighten it into something far more dangerous. Daniel left the overgrown lot with the chair secured in the evidence van, its uneven legs cushioned in foam to preserve any trace material. The convoy did not return to headquarters. Instead, the lead vehicle turned directly toward the second coordinate. Daniel followed, the route pulling them deeper into the industrial fringe where warehouses stood in quiet rows, and the air smelled faintly of oil and damp metal. The second location sat near a narrow service road that bordered a drainage canal. Tall reeds bent in the light wind, and the ground squelched faintly where runoff had collected in shallow depressions. The coordinate point marked a section of cracked concrete pad, the remnants of some dismantled structure. Weeds poked through the fissures, their roots gripping at the gaps. Daniel stepped out and scanned the area. The sound here was muted, the canal water moving sluggishly, carrying bits of debris that clinked faintly when they struck the banks. The team spread into a loose arc, marking a search radius with bright flags. The sunlight was thin, filtered through a layer of cloud that gave everything a dull, cold cast. The point itself was empty at first glance, just a patch of discolored concrete. Daniel crouched and brushed away dirt with a gloved hand. His fingertips met the edge of something smooth and solid beneath the surface layer. He cleared more debris and found a mirror, its surface dulled by a film of dust and streaked with faint mineral stains. It was roughly square, the edges chipped, the glass thick and heavy like those used in older furniture. He recognized the object immediately. It matched a detail from one of the ledger words, mirror, and a cold case where a victim had been found with a small hand mirror placed under their hand. This one, however, was far larger and bore no frame. Daniel ordered it photographed in situ before lifting it carefully onto a clean evidence cloth. Beneath where the mirror had rested, the concrete showed a faint outline, a rectangular shape slightly larger than the mirror itself, marked by a difference in coloration. It suggested that the object had been there for an extended period, shielded from sunlight and weather. Daniel turned the mirror over and found a strip of paper taped to the back. The tape was old, the adhesive dried to a brittle crust. On the paper was another date written in block letters. This date matched one of the ledger's unsolved markers. The edges of the paper were faintly curled, and the ink had bled just enough to suggest dampness at some point in the past. He called the techs over to sweep the surrounding area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. The detectors picked up a small signal just beyond the coordinate point, beneath a layer of compacted soil and weeds. Excavation revealed a tin container, sealed with rusted clasps. Inside were shards of broken glass wrapped in wax paper, each piece bearing a faint blue tint. The pieces fit together like parts of a smaller mirror, perhaps one shattered deliberately. Daniel noted the consistent color, the same pale cast as the marble in the storage unit. He added that to his mental chain of connections: blue marble, blue buttons, blue-tinted glass. The color might be symbolic, a personal marker in the killer's staging ritual. The canal's slow current caught his eye. A section of the bank appeared slightly disturbed, reeds bent at odd angles. He walked over and crouched, scanning the muddy edge. There, pressed into the soil, was the partial impression of a shoe sole. The pattern was faint but familiar, the same chipped heel edge seen in the photograph from under the marble. Daniel directed the photographer to capture it before the light shifted. The impression was shallow, likely recent, as the previous night's moisture would have softened the bank. He noted the alignment, the print pointed toward the service road, away from the coordinates. The discovery lent weight to the theory of an active accomplice or at least a watcher. It also added urgency. If these sites were being checked or tended by someone, the remaining coordinates might be compromised if they delayed. Daniel gave the order to secure the mirror, the tin container, and the soil samples. The chain of custody forms were signed in the field, each item sealed and loaded into the evidence van. The convoy moved as soon as the last flag was pulled from the ground. The drive to the third coordinate would take them toward the edge of a wooded tract bordering a river bend. Daniel knew the site from old case files. It had been searched years earlier with no results. The ledger's script entry, found in the storage unit, did not appear tied to it. This point instead corresponded to Ember, the one word without a known case connection. The vehicles left the industrial zone behind. The air took on the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. The road narrowed, the canopy of bare branches above casting shifting shadows across the windshield. As they approached the drop-off point, Daniel noticed something unusual. A column of faint smoke rose from somewhere beyond the trees, directly in line with the coordinates. The wind carried a thin, acrid scent toward the road. They were not arriving to an undisturbed site. The convoy halted on the narrow shoulder, engines idling low. Daniel stepped out into the cool air and scanned the tree line. The smoke rose in a thin column that wavered with the shifting wind. Its source lay somewhere beyond the third coordinate point, close enough that the scent reached them but far enough that no direct flame was visible. He ordered the first vehicle's occupants to fan out and begin establishing a perimeter along the road's edge. Bright survey tape marked the initial line, giving the team a visual anchor in case they had to fall back. The second vehicle's team moved to the opposite side, setting flags at intervals to create a boundary arc around the projected coordinate. Daniel kept the approach slow. He sent one officer ahead with a thermal scope to scan the tree line for heat signatures. The screen showed faint residual warmth near the ground in several spots, possibly from recent movement or low-level fires that had already burned down. Nothing resembling a full human figure appeared, but the data confirmed activity within the last hour. They advanced in a staggered formation, each step deliberate to avoid noise. The ground was soft with layers of damp leaves, and the air felt thicker as they moved deeper. The scent of the smoke grew stronger, and with it came a faint tang of charred wood mixed with something sharper, chemical in edge. At the edge of a small clearing, Daniel held up his hand to stop the line. In the center, at the exact coordinate point, stood a rusted metal barrel. Wisps of smoke curled from its open top, rising into the pale light filtering through the branches. The barrel was blackened on the inside, the ash at its base still faintly warm. Daniel circled the barrel slowly, eyes scanning the ground for any footprints or drag marks. The soil showed several overlapping impressions, none distinct enough for an immediate match. He signaled for the photographer and scene tech. The ash was sampled with care, each portion placed into separate containers to preserve layering. Among the gray and black flakes, the tech found small fragments that did not match wood or paper, twisted bits of metal, melted plastic, and the edge of what looked like fabric charred to a crisp. Daniel directed that each be bagged individually. One fragment caught his attention, a corner of paper stiffened by heat but not entirely burned. The visible portion carried block letters in black ink, part of a word ending in burr. It could be coincidence, but the ledger's unexplained entry, ember, came to mind at once. Daniel ordered the fragment photographed in high resolution before sealing it in an evidence envelope. The clearing held more than the barrel. Along its eastern edge, half buried in leaves, was a small metal lockbox. It bore scorch marks on one side as if it had been near the fire but not in it. The lock had been forced open, the metal bent outward. Inside, resting against the felt lining, was a single item, a matchbox with a pale blue stripe across its cover. Daniel turned the matchbox over. The back bore a sticker with a handwritten date, matching the style of the wardrobe shelf coordinates. This date fell between two confirmed murders in the killer's timeline, but there was no recorded case for that exact day. The matchbox rattled faintly when tilted, the sound of something small inside. He opened it slowly. Inside were 3 matches, unburned, and a tiny sliver of glass with a faint blue tint. The fragment was barely larger than a fingernail, its edges smooth on one side and jagged on the other. Daniel recognized the same tint as the shards found in the tin at the second coordinate. The recurring color reinforced his suspicion that the blue element tied all the scenes together. The perimeter team reported movement at the northern edge, a rustle in the undergrowth followed by the sound of something retreating deeper into the woods. Daniel froze, calculating the distance. It was far enough to be outside their immediate arc, but close enough to have observed their work. He dispatched 2 officers to track cautiously while maintaining visual contact with each other. The thermal scope was redeployed in that direction, picking up a faint heat trail but no solid target. The readings faded after 30 meters, suggesting either a quick retreat or concealment behind a heat-blocking surface. Back in the clearing, Daniel completed the scene log. The barrel, the ash, the lockbox, and the matchbox were each documented in sequence, their relationships to one another mapped on a scaled diagram. Every sample and object was sealed, tagged, and handed off to the records officer. As they prepared to leave, Daniel took one last sweep around the perimeter of the clearing. At the base of a tree near the southern edge, he spotted a length of thin wire partly buried in the leaf litter. Following it a short distance, he found it anchored to a small metal spike driven into the ground. The purpose was unclear. It might have been part of a snare, a trip alert, or something unrelated entirely. Still, in the context of the killer's theatrical tendencies, it demanded attention. Daniel had the wire collected, its location marked on the diagram. Then he stepped back, looking once more at the barrel's faint smoke curling upward. The fire had been recent, deliberate, and connected to the ledger's lone unexplained entry. The team began the walk back to the vehicles. Daniel knew the final coordinate might be the most critical. It was the only one with no direct tie to a ledger word and no connection yet to any case file. If the killer's staging pattern held, the fourth site could be the start of something new rather than a relic of the past. And new meant active. Daniel returned to the task force briefing room with the evidence vans pulling in behind him. The sun had dipped low, leaving the parking lot awash in sodium light. Inside, the room was already set with fresh coffee, new case boards, and a wide table cleared for the incoming items. The walls were lined with photographs from the storage unit and the 3 coordinates already searched. He began the review with the chair from the first site. It rested on a padded stand under a dustproof cover. High-resolution images of the uneven legs, the irregular stains, and the metal tag were projected onto the wall. The tag's etched date was compared against the ledger timeline. It fell in a gap where no confirmed case existed, suggesting either an unrecorded victim or a symbolic marker. Soil analysis from the chair legs was underway. Early results indicated a mixture of clay and industrial grit consistent with certain urban demolition sites. Next came the mirror from the second site. Its surface had been cleaned enough for lab examination, revealing faint fingerprints in a partial arc along one edge. The prints were too incomplete for identification, but did suggest handling without gloves. The tin container with the blue-tinted shards was placed beside it, the fragments arranged under magnification to show their shared composition with the mirror's glass. From the canal bank came the photograph of the shoe's sole impression. When projected side by side with the marble photograph from the storage unit, the match was obvious. The chipped heel edge and partial logo were identical. The lab had isolated the logo enough to identify a likely manufacturer, a brand no longer in production for over a decade. This narrowed the pool to older shoes, possibly kept deliberately for staging purposes. The review moved to the third site, where the barrel's ash had yielded 3 distinct material types: charred wood, synthetic fabric, and residue from a slow-burning chemical accelerant. The partially burned paper fragment ending in burr was stabilized for analysis. A lab tech speculated that it could have once read ember or timber, though the connection to the ledger's ember entry was difficult to dismiss. The lockbox's matchbox with its pale blue stripe was examined under magnification, revealing faint smudges of a different color paint on the underside, a muted red, not found at any of the other sites yet. The small glass fragment inside matched the composition of the mirror shards, reinforcing the idea that these pieces were deliberately spread across multiple locations as connective elements. Daniel drew the threads together on the board. The blue motif now had 4 confirmed appearances: the marble, the buttons, the mirror glass, and the matchbox stripe. The chipped heel impression linked the storage unit photograph, the canal bank, and at least 1 cold case. The dates on the tags and paper strips filled gaps in the known timeline, each one falling in a span without a confirmed victim. Sanders leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. The emerging pattern was clear. The killer's narrative was not limited to known cases. The ledger and the coordinates suggested a larger, more deliberate structure, with staging sites left as markers in a sequence that spanned years. The involvement of an accomplice or at least a caretaker seemed more plausible with each discovery. The team debated the fourth coordinate. It was the only one without a ledger word or direct case tie. Some saw it as a potential trap, others as the most likely place to find something fresh. Daniel listened without interrupting, weighing the risks. The possibility of the site being active meant it could contain evidence untainted by time, or it could mean walking into a scene designed for them. He reviewed the sequence of past discoveries again, noting the escalation in complexity from the chair to the mirror to the barrel. Each site had introduced a new layer, a concealed tag, a secondary object, a potential surveillance presence. If the pattern held, the fourth site might be the culmination of the current sequence. The decision was made to approach the final coordinate at first light with full resources. Surveillance drones would be deployed in advance to check for movement. The perimeter would be set well beyond the site to catch any approach or retreat. The search team would be kept smaller to limit disturbance, but rapid response units would be staged nearby in case of contact with a person of interest. Daniel left the room with the plan in place. In the hallway outside, the board's arrangement stayed in his mind: blue, chipped heel, hidden dates, sequential escalation. The killer's staging had the precision of a script, and they were now at the final act. Whether that act had already been performed, or was waiting for them to play their parts, would be decided tomorrow. The morning air was cold enough to leave frost on the grass along the staging area. The search team assembled at the edge of a gravel turnout, their vehicles parked out of sight from the fourth coordinate. Two drones sat on portable launch pads, their rotors glinting faintly in the early light. Daniel stood with the drone operator, reviewing the map overlay one last time. The site lay in a low depression ringed by sparse woodland, its ground partially obscured from above by the canopy. The first drone lifted quietly, rising above the tree line before angling toward the depression. Its feed appeared on a rugged tablet held between them. The overhead view showed patches of bare earth, clusters of dead leaves, and a single narrow path winding in from the north. Daniel noted the absence of recent tire tracks, though the path looked compacted enough for foot travel. The second drone launched and took a lower, slower route, circling the depression's perimeter. A faint glint caught its camera, a small reflective surface half buried at the base of a tree. The operator marked the coordinates for later ground inspection. The main depression came into clearer view as the drones adjusted their angles. At the exact coordinate point, the ground appeared disturbed, not a full excavation, but a patch of soil darker than its surroundings. Daniel had seen similar coloration at scenes where earth had been recently turned and then covered again. On the eastern side of the depression, the lower drone's camera picked up something else, a rectangular object partially hidden under a sheet of weathered tarp. The edges were straight, the corners sharp, and the surface carried a pale blue hue even under the morning light. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. The shade was almost identical to the blue marble and the mirror shards. The drones continued their sweep, revealing no movement in the immediate vicinity. Thermal scans showed only the heat signatures of small animals in the underbrush. Still, Daniel ordered a final pass over the northern approach path. There, near a bend, the drone caught a faint line in the dirt, the impression of a sole. The pattern was partial but carried the same chipped heel outline as the previous prints. With the area mapped and points of interest marked, Daniel assembled the entry team. They would advance from the south, avoiding the northern path where the print had been found. Two officers would remain in overwatch positions with long-range optics, while the rest moved in to secure the depression. The walk-in was slow, the frost crunching faintly under their boots. Daniel kept his eyes forward, the tree line thinning as they neared the perimeter. The tarp-covered object lay ahead, its blue surface dulled by dirt and weather. The disturbed patch of soil was to the right, exactly where the drone had marked it. He held the team at the edge, scanning for anything that might indicate tampering or traps. The ground bore no wires, no unusual indentations beyond the print they had seen earlier. Satisfied, Daniel moved to the tarp. He pulled it back in a single motion, revealing a metal storage trunk. Its paint was faded, but the blue color beneath the grime was unmistakable. A small tag hung from the front handle, the paper weathered but still legible, another date in block letters, one that matched no known case. Daniel photographed the trunk in place, then checked the latch. It was not locked, only held closed by a corroded clasp. When he lifted it, the hinges groaned softly. Inside, the trunk was neatly organized. On the left side sat a series of small cloth pouches, each labeled in the same block hand as the ledger. On the right, a stack of black and white photographs bound with twine. The pouches contained objects wrapped in tissue: a button, a coin, a fragment of cloth, a small carved figurine. Each item was tagged with a date matching gaps in the ledger's known sequence. The photographs, when unbound, showed staged scenes, empty rooms with objects placed in precise arrangements. No people appeared in the images, but the layouts echoed the confirmed crime scenes. A chair angled just so, a mirror leaning against a wall, a small mound of sand in the corner of a bare floor. Daniel's attention shifted to the disturbed patch of soil nearby. He moved to it and knelt, brushing away the top layer with a gloved hand. Beneath lay a shallow wooden box, its lid secured by nails driven flush. The wood was weathered but intact. The team photographed it in place before carefully prying it open. Inside was a single object, a shoe. The heel bore the same chip seen in the impressions and the marble photograph. The leather was cracked, the sole worn thin. It was a left shoe only, positioned neatly within the box as if displayed. A slip of paper rested beside it, bearing another coordinate written in block letters, a coordinate that did not match any of the previous four. Daniel felt the air shift. This was not the final act. This was a continuation, a handoff to whatever came next. Daniel remained crouched over the wooden box, the paper slip balanced on his gloved palm. The coordinates stared back in the same deliberate handwriting, each digit and degree marked with the same mechanical precision as every tag and note they had recovered so far. Around him, the air felt sharper, the kind of cold that prickled at the skin and slowed movement without notice. Sanders' voice came low over the comm from the overwatch position, asking for a sitrep. Daniel gave a clipped report, the trunk, the pouches, the photographs, the shoe, and now a new location. The mention of it pulled a pause on the channel, then Sanders asked if they had confirmed the coordinates' placement. Daniel read it aloud for the records officer, who entered it into a GPS receiver. The screen blinked before returning a result. The location was less than 4 miles away, deep inside a patch of mixed forest with no mapped road access. The team gathered closer, their boots marking faint arcs in the frost. The proximity meant one of two things. The killer had set up a layered sight sequence within walking distance, or the accomplice had adapted the plan recently, keeping everything close to control movement. Daniel considered the shoe, a left shoe only, preserved in its own box. It could be the physical match to the imprint from the marble photograph, a way of tying the entire pattern into a single artifact. He ordered the shoe photographed and secured. The pouches and photographs from the trunk were packed next, each in a separate evidence bag. The drone operator sent the second unit ahead toward the new coordinate while the first remained overhead, tracking their position for security. The feed came back with shifting tree cover and uneven ground, but no visible structures. The heat scan revealed a single small warm signature at the coordinate point, too small for a person, but steady enough to be an object heated from within. The suggestion of an active heat source raised the stakes. Daniel relayed the information to Sanders and recommended an immediate move while daylight remained. Waiting risked losing whatever was generating that signature. Sanders authorized the advance. The team left 2 officers to guard the trunk site, maintaining the perimeter while Daniel led the rest northward. The terrain sloped gradually, the ground alternating between patches of frost-stiffened grass and soft loam where water had pooled. The forest canopy thinned in places, letting angled sunlight reach the leaf litter below. Half a mile in, the drone operator reported a second heat signature moving away from the coordinate point at a slow, irregular pace. The reading was faint but consistent with a human profile. Daniel halted the line and reassigned 2 officers to shadow the moving signature at distance while the rest continued forward. The new coordinate came into view as a shallow depression lined with flat stones. At its center stood a small metal container, no larger than a lunchbox, with a cable running from its side into the soil. A faint curl of vapor rose from its seams, dissipating quickly in the cold air. Daniel approached slowly, scanning for trip wires or signs of tampering. None were visible. The container was warm to the touch through his gloves. He photographed it before directing the tech to check for radiation or volatile gases. Both readings came back negative. The latch was simple, a sliding metal catch that lifted without resistance. Inside, the container held a ceramic dish filled with fine white sand, the same grain and color as the marble display from the storage unit. Embedded in the center of the sand was a single burned matchstick, its head reduced to ash. Resting beside the dish was a folded slip of paper. Daniel lifted it carefully and unfolded it to reveal another date written in the same block lettering. This date was less than 3 weeks old. It was the most recent marker they had seen in the entire investigation. The immediacy of it changed the weight of the scene. This was not archival staging. It was fresh, deliberate, and timed to be found. Daniel sealed the container and its contents, logging every movement for the camera. The team regrouped, the shadow unit reporting that their moving heat signature had vanished near a bend in a shallow creek. No visual contact had been made. Daniel looked once more at the white sand and burned match, then at the forest beyond. The killer's pattern was no longer about the past. It was being written now, in real time, and they were following it step for step. Daniel arrived at the prison under a sky the color of worn steel. The intake gate clanged shut behind him, sealing out the sound of the wind across the yard. His case binder felt heavier than usual in his grip, the weight of the evidence within it more psychological than physical. He passed through the metal detectors, signed the entry log, and was escorted down the same corridor he had walked days earlier. The visiting hall was as stark as before: bolted tables, scuffed floors, the faint smell of disinfectant clinging to every surface. The killer was already seated, hands folded loosely on the tabletop, his posture relaxed but with attention coiled beneath it. The guard nodded for Daniel to sit, then stepped back to the wall. Daniel placed the binder on the table without opening it. He began in a measured tone, recounting the 4 coordinates they had followed, the items recovered, and the shoe that matched the imprint from the marble photograph. His words carried no accusation, only the deliberate cadence of a status report. The killer's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a narrowing of the eyes when the trunk was mentioned, a faint lift of the brow at the description of the wooden box. Daniel continued, detailing the new coordinate found inside the shoe's box, the heat source in the forest, the ceramic dish of white sand, and the single burned match. He noted the date on the folded slip, less than 3 weeks old, and let the silence that followed stretch until the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. The killer tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next move. His hands remained still, but Daniel noticed a slight flex in the fingers, a tell of contained reaction. The calm demeanor was intact, yet beneath it something had shifted. Daniel leaned forward just enough to bridge the space between them. He spoke of the shoe, the coordinates, the ledger dates, and the recurrence of the pale blue motif. He framed it not as a question but as an acknowledgement of authorship, an unspoken recognition that the staging was not random and not relic. The killer's mouth curved in the faintest trace of a smile, the kind that carried no warmth. His gaze locked on Daniel, steady and unblinking. There was no verbal confession, but the reaction was enough to register as an answer, a silent ownership of the pattern, coupled with the knowledge that it was incomplete. Daniel let the moment stand, then closed the binder and rose from the table. The guard stepped forward, unlocking the restraint chain from the table leg. As the killer was led away, his parting glance was the same one he had given after their first meeting, a look that said the next move was already decided, and Daniel was already part of it. Outside, the yard wind cut through Daniel's jacket, the cold sharper now. He walked toward the gate knowing the investigation had not reached an end. The pattern was still unfolding, the ledger not yet filled. Somewhere beyond the walls, the next coordinate might already exist, waiting for them to find it.